In the early 1960s, a new recreational drug was on the streets. It was cheap, it was readily available, and it promised to open up your mind and unlock your inner self. And this could go one of two ways. You could either take it, have your inner self unlocked, and discover that you're a wonderful, creative person full of love and harmony and happiness. Or you could take it, have your inner self unlocked, and find out that you're just an emotional wreck. This drug was called L.S.D, and today's public service announcement, you're going to learn all about it. So I hope that you enjoy. Thank you for tuning in. Have a great today and an even better tomorrow.
Coming up, it was the improbable common denominator that linked Cary Grant, Allen Ginsberg, Charles Manson, and the CIA.
Lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. It's a mind-bending drug, an astoundingly powerful hallucinogen that played a pivotal role in the cultural upheaval of the 1960s.
He thought that he had found a substance that wouldn't just change behavior, it would change culture.
While a generation was turning on, tuning in, and dropping out, powerful forces within the American government thought that LSD might be the ultimate chemical warfare weapon. They set out to prove it, often with tragic results.
It's hard to believe that a U.S. government agency, the CIA, would do things with drugs like the Nazis did during World War II.
2,000 years ago, the Greeks held an annual rite at Eleusis in which they drank a sacred liquid called kykeon that induced hallucinogenic visions. Those who took it were said to have changed after seeing the world differently. The Golden Age, it seems, was psychedelic as well. Was popular interest in LSD a modern-day version of the ancient mystery schools? Join us for Getting High, a history of LSD.
Like a genie released from a bottle, it has the capacity for great good or terrible evil.
The word profound, I think, can definitely be applied to it, because any time you have the occasion, whatever it may be, to have a real shift in consciousness, it is definitely profound.
No, it's not addicting. No, it does not affect your genetic system. Do people go crazy under it? Absolutely.
It is a drug so powerful that for a brief time during the 1960s, it shakes the very foundation of society. It spawns the summer of love, fuels revolt in the streets, and its main disciple, Timothy Leary, is labeled the most dangerous man in America. Nearly everyone who comes in contact with it is deeply affected.
LSD will, without a doubt, without a shadow of doubt, whatever else you will say about it, will change completely a person's worldview forever. It will never be the same again, whether the experience was positive or negative.
The long, strange trip of LSD is a fantastic journey into the deepest reaches of inner space. The trip begins in Basel, Switzerland in 1943, when chemist Albert Hofmann stumbles upon the formula for LSD at Sandoz Labs while searching for a drug to stimulate the circulation of blood in the body. For the past 8 years, Hofmann has been studying the properties of ergot, a fungus that grows on diseased kernels of rye. The fungus has a mysterious and varied reputation. In China and the Middle East, it is known for its medicinal qualities. In ancient Greece, it may have been an ingredient in the sacred drink used in ceremonies at Eleusis. But the fungus, ergot, is also the suspected cause of St. Anthony's fire, a terrifying condition that afflicted people throughout Europe who consumed diseased rye.
And the whole village would go crazy. They would, in essence, go off on an LSD trip. People would end up dancing wildly in the streets, jumping out of windows in their houses.
Hoffman first synthesized LSD in 1938, but he had no idea of its potential. Now, on April 16, 1943, feeling perhaps that he missed something during his initial tests, he mixes a new batch.
And he apparently absorbed some of the drug through his skin that day because he began feeling lightheaded and sick, he thought. And so he went home, climbed into bed, and instead of getting flu-like symptoms, he had some rather extraordinary hallucinations.
Intrigued by the experience, Hoffman decides to ingest the drug again the following Monday. He takes what he thinks is a small dose.
This very small dose, the first dose of my experiments I planned, was very, very strong.
He bicycled home, climbed into bed. His family was away at the time, and so he had a lot of fear that he had perhaps damaged his mind by doing this. He lay in bed. At one point, his consciousness was up on the ceiling, looking down on what he took to be his dead body.
And the object, like this chair, was like if he was a living object. It became moving from inside.
He survived the night, and in the morning, rather than feeling hellish at all, he felt wonderful. He felt reborn. He went out into his garden. Everything was sparkling with life.
Although the drug doesn't work as a circulatory stimulant, Hoffman and his colleagues at Sandoz come to the conclusion that LSD may serve as an important tool for studying how the mind works. Little do they realize that they are unleashing upon the world a substance that will someday have a powerful effect on society. A substance Hoffman will come to call his problem child. But to begin with, Sandoz offers LSD to certain researchers who have been working with test subjects to produce altered states of minds by using drugs such as mescaline. These drugs allow researchers to artificially induce temporary madness in order to study such mental diseases as schizophrenia.
This was a very important subject in science at the time. It was really felt that the person that could come up with the clue to madness would win a Nobel Prize.
One of these researchers, a pioneer in the study of schizophrenia, is Dr. Humphrey Osmond of Saskatchewan, Canada. During the late 40s and early 50s, his experiments with mescaline gain wide attention. One of those closely following Osmond's work is the celebrated author of Brave New World, Aldous Huxley. Although nearly blind, Huxley compensates for this handicap with his extraordinary intelligence. His life seems dedicated to a continuous quest for knowledge.
And he was considered by European intellectuals probably the brightest young literary man of his generation in any of the Western countries.
Huxley is fascinated with the possibility of expanding his consciousness through the use of drugs such as mescaline. He has studied cultures whose members ingest plants with hallucinogenic properties to stimulate godlike visions. He theorizes that there is a mechanism in the brain that can open a door to a higher realm of consciousness. Humphrey Osmond is stunned when Huxley volunteers to be a guinea pig in his mescaline experiments. By using mescaline as a spiritual seeker, not a scientist, Huxley enters the surreal world of spiritual imagery.
Everything he looked at was transfigured. When he looked at plants, he could just see them, rather like Albert Hofmann before him, bursting with life, bursting with color.
After his experience with mescaline, Huxley begins encouraging others to try it as well.
In essence, what Huxley was saying was that drugs like LSD should be seen as a potential boon for mankind, for humankind. That they could be used not simply in a scientific context, but they could be used by normal people to study themselves, to investigate themselves as a tool of self-exploration and self-discovery.
Huxley writes a book about the experience in 1954. It is titled The Doors of Perception, after the observation by poet William Blake that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything will appear to man as it is, infinite. The book attracts a wide range of readers, including people in the CIA, the Army, and Soviet intelligence. Hallucinogenic drugs, and LSD in particular, will soon be targeted as potential weapons in the escalating Cold War. When we return, the CIA experiments with LSD as a tool to embarrass America's Cold War enemies.
People from the CIA would sit behind two-way mirrors and watched all the action, both the drugging and the sex.
In the early 1950s, long before he became the guru of psychedelic experiences, Timothy Leary devised a personality test called the Leary. It was used by the CIA to test prospective employees. History's Mysteries will be right back here on the History Channel.
Did a thirst for beer play a role in the colonizing of America? From the History Channel, the official network of every millennium, this is Time Lab 2000. The Mayflower is headed for Virginia, but ends up putting ashore at Plymouth Rock. One pilgrim's diary explains why. We could not take time for further search or consideration, our victuals being much spent, especially our beer. Yes, the pilgrims made port because they ran out of beer, then considered an essential and a healthy part of everyone's daily diet. Once ashore, they promptly erected a brew house and got to work brewing up a new batch to slake their thirsts. So Plymouth, Massachusetts ended up becoming the historic home of the Pilgrims because they needed to make a beer run. For the History Channel, I'm Sam Waterston.
We now return to Getting High, the history of LSD.
Physicians see LSD as a tool for understanding the mind. Philosophers see it as a key to the spiritual world. But the CIA theorizes that it can be a major weapon of war. In 1947, the Cold War has begun, and the newly created Central Intelligence Agency starts a dogged search for the perfect truth serum, or mind control drug. Research on LSD is done under the auspices of the top-secret MK Ultra program, which is designed to develop drugs as weapons of war. LSD receives more attention and study than any other drug. It is colorless, odorless, tasteless, and just a small quantity is unbelievably powerful. However, initial tests of the drug as a truth serum proved disappointing.
And LSD, though being very promising, also was uncontrollable. Some people would get paranoid, but then get blissful. You couldn't really interrogate them because the things that were happening in their mind were sending them elsewhere.
Not willing to give up on the drug, they decided it might be used for covert operations.
You could use it to confuse and embarrass political leaders like Castro or various dictators they wanted to get rid of by somehow slipping at them. So they'd slip it into a cocktail glass and maybe the person would embarrass themselves and do all kinds of crazy things.
For LSD to work in covert operations, the element of surprise is crucial. To test its effects, government researchers covertly slip it to each other at the office.
And it was normally mixed with Coke or with coffee or milk or something like that. And it's tasteless and colorless, so the man wasn't aware of the fact that he was taking it.
But in fact, that did happen to quite a great degree in the early and mid-1950s. But they had to figure out how to use it properly as an espionage weapon. They would slip into each other's coffee, and then right away they say, oh, by the way, you've gotten it, better prepare to take the day off for work.
In November of 1953, this unorthodox research gets out of control during a work retreat at a hunting lodge in the backwoods of Maryland. Attending are CIA technicians and Army biological warfare scientists.
Some of these CIA people decided to administer LSD in the after-dinner drink for several of the scientists there who had no experience with LSD. And one of those scientists, Dr. Frank Olson, had a very difficult experience. You might call it a bad trip.
When he reports back to work the following Monday, he exhibits such erratic behavior that his Army superiors contact the CIA for help.
They spent a couple of weeks babysitting him, and then in early December, he plunged to his death from a 10th floor of a hotel in New York City. It seemed that he committed suicide. That was the understanding later on when some of this information came out. You have to understand, this was a hot potato the CIA was dealing with. You had a scientist from the Army who had been given LSD as a part of one of these CIA experiments who ends up dying as a result. There's some controversy now whether he actually threw himself out of the window or whether he was pushed.
For more than 2 decades, the CIA hides the facts surrounding Olson's death. In the early 1970s, news reports provoke congressional hearings on the incident. President Gerald Ford personally apologizes to the Olson family. And in 1976, Congress passes a bill to pay $750,000 in compensation to Mrs. Olson and her 3 children. Yet the Olsons doubt the suicide story. They believe it is possible Olson was pushed from the hotel window because he posed a security risk. The family doggedly investigates the incident, and in 1994, after exhuming Frank Olson's body, an autopsy raises enough questions about foul play that the New York District Attorney agrees to reopen the case. But Olson's death fails to stop the CIA's so-called research in the 1950s. Its next project, Operation Midnight Climax, is truly fantastic. CIA operatives persuade drug-addicted prostitutes to slip LSD to unsuspecting customers in bordellos set up by the agency.
People from the CIA would sit behind two-way mirrors and watched all the action, both the drugging and the sex. And this is not a great way to gather information from a scientific point of view, but this is what the CIA felt it had to do to get information on what would happen when LSD was given to people surreptitiously. And because they knew they had to know this before they would actually use it in this way in the operations.
Although extremely unethical, this type of secret operation is defended within the agency as being important for national defense.
It was one of their deepest held secrets that they were doing this, but because of the Cold War, they really felt no stone unturned, no weapon kept in the holster, no tool kept in the shed. If this was, this was going to be useful, we should study it. And there was also the feeling that if we're not studying it, the enemy is.
During this same time, another group is also researching LSD with entirely different results. Some in the mental health profession use it as a tool to tap the unconscious mind.
It seemed to speed up the process. You could give small doses of LSD in a typical shrink's office, and over the course of several weeks, do several years' work.
They learn that both the patient's moods and the setting in which the drug is administered have enormous effects on the patient's reactions. The drug seems to amplify everything.
You want to have a safe, supportive setting with beautiful aesthetic objects around, music and so forth, and set and setting are right, and you have the guidance and the assistance of others who are more experienced, then you have the potential for really understanding how your mind works.
This helps explain why the CIA's experiments provoke hellish reactions from some people on LSD, while others have a blissful experience. By administering the drug in a hostile environment, the CIA almost guarantees a negative reaction. In 1957, a new word is coined by Dr. Humphrey Osmond to describe drugs like LSD and mescaline: psychedelic. It means mind manifesting, suggesting the drugs do not produce a predictable sequence of events, but instead bring to the surface thoughts and feelings from the subconscious. By the late 1950s, psychedelic therapy is the hot topic in the mental health community. Many who undergo it experience changes in personality, religious and philosophical beliefs, and sometimes lifestyle. In Hollywood, therapists make the drug available to a wide variety of celebrities, including Cary Grant, singer, dancer, actor Rita Moreno, and composer Andre Previn, and even Time Life publisher Henry Luce. Grant, who reportedly takes more than 100 LSD trips, claims LSD is the only therapy he's tried that gives him peace of mind. One California therapist, Dr. Oscar Janiger, realizes the drug is not always predictable.
I emphatically do not believe that everybody should have LSD. There are people who are living on the fringe of reality who will knock them over into a cocked hat.
When we continue, Dr. Timothy Leary begins his long, strange trip.
He felt that he had merged with the Godhead, that he had seen the light, and that it was his job now to turn on everybody.
In the mid-1950s, the Army's chief of chemical intelligence preached a new military doctrine of war without death and proposed testing hallucinogenic gases on American subways.
To discover more about the history of hallucinogens, please visit our website at historychannel.com. We now return to Getting High, the history of LSD.
Timothy Leary, the man whose name becomes synonymous with psychedelic drugs, first comes into contact with them while on vacation in Mexico in 1960. Recently appointed to a lectureship at Harvard University, he appears to have a golden future ahead of him in academia. Yet he is profoundly bored and dissatisfied. He's a man looking for something to happen.
Timothy Leary had one of the great midlife crises of our time. He was 40 years old when he first took the magic mushroom.
Leary first reads about the psilocybin mushrooms in an article published in Life magazine in 1957. Now, while suffering through a bout of vacation boredom and midlife crisis, he decides to try them. His encounter with the mushroom is nothing short of profound. He will later say it is without question the deepest religious experience of his life.
The idea came up when he had this life-changing, what he called a life-changing experience in Mexico on a summer vacation with the magic mushroom. He decided to devote his life to exploring the potentials of this as a tool.
The effect is somewhat like looking through a microscope. Suddenly, when you look through a microscope, you discover that there's an invisible world around you that you hadn't known about before you did it. The same thing is true with a psychedelic drug.
Leary sets up the Harvard Psilocybin Research Project, a wide-ranging study to investigate the emotional and creative effects of this mushroom pill. Leary's timing couldn't be better. Albert Hofmann, the chemist who discovered LSD, has recently learned how to synthesize psilocybin.
He thought of himself as an ambitious scientist. He thought he'd found a substance that would allow him to change behavior. And that was really his main interest as a psychologist. Not just understanding people, but in taking somebody who was deeply disturbed or deeply unhappy and fundamentally changing their behavior.
In 1961, Leary gives psilocybin to convicts as part of an experiment to reform them.
I remember him saying, let's see if we can turn the convicts into Buddhas by giving them this profound religious experience, insight, and maybe they will change their way.
The experiment takes place at the Massachusetts Correctional Institute in Concord, where psilocybin is given to 32 inmates. The hope is that the drug will alter their personalities so that once they're released from prison, their recidivism rate will go down. Leary and his group often take the drug with the prisoners, acting as guides through the process. In the short term, only 25% of those who take the drug return to prison, as compared to the normal rate of 80%. But some critics dispute the results because Leary gets involved in the ex-convicts' lives, unintentionally skewing the outcome.
It was learned that after they did get out, Leary and his graduate students helped get them jobs. The rather extraordinary results of the prison project were generally criticized on that factor.
In early 1962, the British writer Aldous Huxley meets a researcher who has been experimenting with LSD and sends him off to introduce Leary to the powerful hallucinogen.
He felt that he had merged with the Godhead, that he had seen the light, and that it was his job now to turn on everybody, to turn on the whole world so that they could share this wonderful experience.
Suddenly he was not talking about making convicts better citizens. He was talking about changing the whole religious, political, cultural structure of the United States.
Leary is no longer a passive scholar. He is now the voice that articulates the psychedelic vision. He is on a path that will make him the leader of a revolution.
So he had charisma to burn. He was an Irish philosopher, poet who had an incredible gift of oratory. He was one of the most brilliant speakers, and there would be kind of an almost electrical charge in the room as he would talk about that, and almost like a mystical experience would occur right there and then, even just through his talking about it. A large crowd of people who would be eating out of his hand.
Everything you've heard about the dangers of LSD is an outright hoax and a lie. LSD is not as dangerous as color television.
Championing this new cause turns Leary into a celebrity.
He always intimated that he was not comfortable with it, but I think he was very comfortable with it. I think that he enjoyed the attention, the adulation. He enjoyed the fact that the rich and famous were calling him up and wanting to come and experience these substances. Even the famous poets like Allen Ginsberg. He really felt that he was moving into a much hipper crowd.
Aldous Huxley is also an LSD advocate, but his philosophy is much different than Leary's. Huxley believes the drug should only be in the hands of the best and the brightest, that it may be too much for the masses. Leary disagrees. He thinks a wide range of people should sample it.
He was very clear, including in testimony to Congress, that there should be some kind of a preparation, there should be some kind of registration or licensing process for drug use, just like there is for driving a car. That you had to have the knowledge and demonstrate that you had knowledge and responsibility.
Few listen to Leary's warnings, but millions tune in to his intriguing description of the LSD experience. The floodgates are starting to open. Across the country, people are beginning to experiment with the drug, particularly those living in college communities. Many serious LSD researchers fear Leary's message could open a Pandora's box.
Tim was approached by many people who were using LSD in the psychedelic therapeutic community and basically told to tone it down, you know, keep a lower profile. You're going to blow it for everyone. But he was so convinced that he had found the answer that he didn't listen.
Leary's rebellious streak makes him in many ways his own worst enemy. When criticized, he often says something outrageous just to provoke a reaction.
If I were to say, ladies and gentlemen, there's a level of reality which is invisible to the naked eye, but which has a lawfulness and a beauty of its own, you'd consider me to be an eccentric.
His new notoriety and accusations of sloppy research compel Harvard to rein him in. In the spring of 1962, Leary is ordered to give up his legal supply of psilocybin, and by the end of the year, the psilocybin research project is terminated. A year later, Leary is officially relieved of his teaching duties. Upon leaving Harvard, he says, "It's as unfair to expect a university to sponsor research on visionary experience as it would be to expect the Vatican to support research on effective aphrodisiacs." Leary and his followers need a place to continue their research. They are thrown out of Mexico and the Caribbean islands of Dominica and Antigua because of the growing notoriety associated with LSD. After 3 months of searching, they are offered use of the immense Millbrook estate in Dutchess County, New York. It is the property of heirs to the Gulf oil fortune.
Peggy Hitchcock was a close friend of Leary's, and her two brothers, Billy and Tommy, owned this place, and they lived in a mansion on another part of the estate, and they gave us the mansion free, basically a tax write-off for them.
Millbrook was one of the great house parties of the 20th century. Some research was going on, but increasingly, probably due to its proximity to New York and also to the kind of word of mouth that was spreading the word about LSD, more and more beautiful people, jet setters, began making their way there.
At Millbrook, Leary moves further away from his role as a serious academic and into that of the high priest of LSD. Soon, he's chanting his own mantra.
Turn on, tune in, and drop out.
When we continue, a young writer named Ken Kesey creates a traveling psychedelic circus and takes a new generation on an LSD road trip.
In a few months, Ken Kesey probably turned on more people than the CIA, the psychotherapeutic community, and Tim Leary did in 10 years.
Elsewhere in the world, in 1963, in Switzerland, the pharmaceutical laboratory Roche introduced Valium. In London, cabinet officer John Profumo was forced to resign because of a sex scandal. And Russia's cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman to go up in space. History's Mysteries will return on the History Channel. We now return to Getting High, the history of LSD.
In the early 1960s, Timothy Leary is making headlines on the East Coast, while writer Ken Kesey is blazing his own LSD trail in the West.
Kesey was a classic American hero in many ways. He was a small-town boy, athlete, but also an intellectual. He was a wrestler. He went to Stanford writing program, wanting to become a novelist.
Kesey is introduced to psychedelics when he volunteers as a subject for drug experiments being conducted at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital near San Francisco. Poet Allen Ginsberg later tells him the tests were for the CIA.
And I get psilocybin, I get cannabinol, I get mescaline. Later, Ginsberg says, "Don't you know this is the CIA?" That's all, Ginsburg. You're being your usual paranoid Jew. He says, no, it's the CIA. This stuff wasn't being given to us to help cure insanity or to help these people that are in the nut house. This is being given us to help the CIA figure out what good it was. Does it make you stronger? Does it make you fiercer? Does it make you break down and tell the secrets? What does it do that the CIA could use?
Intrigued by the experience, Kesey volunteers as a night attendant in the psychiatric ward of the hospital. Psychedelic drugs are readily available there, and he takes them while on duty. Kesey's experiences at the hospital inspire him to write a novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He claims the drugs enhanced his creativity.
I would have not been able to write that well without LSD. There's something about seeing a reality with a new light shined on it that goes right from your eyes to your fingertips.
Like Timothy Leary, Kesey becomes a total convert to the drug and its power. He starts spreading the word by turning on his friends.
They became known as the pranksters, who also began taking LSD with him.
I didn't feel that it was right for it to be contained by the CIA and the Vets Administration doctors. Those are not the right people to administer a psychedelic.
Kesey's merry pranksters take their show on the road in a psychedelic bus. They throw wild parties and turn on thousands of people with their LSD-laced punch. Kesey calls the events acid tests.
The idea is you go, you take LSD, you have a great time, presumably, or maybe sometimes you have some weird experiences. But if you are able to endure that kind of excitement and commotion and the music and the strobe lights and the body paint and this whole environmental theater that you were going through, then you pass the acid test.
Kesey's advocacy of LSD pushes even Leary's ideas about popular use of the drug to their limits.
In a few months, Ken Kesey probably turned on more people than the CIA, the psychotherapeutic community, and Tim Leary did in 10 years. So in many ways, he just took the volume and cranked it up, which is what was happening in the 60s all over the place.
Kesey also happens to be in the right place at the right time, the San Francisco Bay Area. Its heart is in a district called Haight-Ashbury.
The Haight-Ashbury was a development in progress. People started to be aware of each other and to relate with each other. Artists, poets, playwrights, men, women began using marijuana and then a little later LSD, and it started to bring us all together.
Haight-Ashbury becomes a community built around drugs, youth, music, and a generally radical way of looking at life. Young people are angry about the escalating war in Vietnam, disillusioned with the values of their parents, and longing to break free of old conventions.
We were looking for something that had more power, more passion, and more freedom in it than the 50s. The 50s were comfortable and closed. So we were trying to break through that, and LSD certainly helped.
Singer Grace Slick is at the center of the Haight-Ashbury Revolution. A member of the Jefferson Airplane rock band and author of the psychedelic anthem, White Rabbit, she remembers her first encounter with hallucinogens.
But they all do sort of the same thing, and that is rearrange what you thought was real. And they remind you of the beauty of very simple things. You forget, because you're so busy going from A to Z, that there's 24 letters in between.
Adapting the universal term of approval employed by the free spirits living in Haight-Ashbury, a San Francisco journalist dubs them hippies. Although conservative older America comes to despise them, the youth of the country embrace them.
And you'd read about it, and you knew if you really wanted to find out what was going on, you had to come to San Francisco. And the mythic words Haight-Ashbury, you had to make a pilgrimage there.
LSD affects nearly every aspect of hippie culture, from lifestyle to music to clothing. As the capital of the psychedelic movement, Haight-Ashbury is a unique experiment in alternative lifestyles. To a large extent, LSD, Albert Hofmann's problem child, fuels the revolution.
And the thing that I think characterized San Francisco more than any other revolution was LSD. I mean, people have tried to organize before around working conditions or living conditions or social issues, but the thing that made it so unique was that there was a magic pill.
Yet not everyone is enamored with the magic pill or the culture built around it. All across the country, Americans view LSD with increasing alarm and suspicion.
There was a feeling that you could take a college graduate from Indiana U and give him LSD and create a hippie. That's what it was sort of college baby boomer plus LSD equals hippie. And hippie equals somebody who's dropping out and probably wants to overthrow the government and the culture of America.
The drug also begins to divide the mental health establishment. Although some therapists swear by it, there is no consensus about its benefits.
It wasn't the type of drug you give to cure the common cold or something. It didn't have a specific purpose that you would take it for, that you would cure a specific problem. LSD was sort of more wide open than that. In that sense, it was out of kilter with the fundamental assumptions of the Western medical establishment.
So by the mid-60s, the government declares war on LSD. With increasing frequency, hospitals admit patients who freak out during bad acid trips.
They really felt this is a thing that escaped from the lab and it better be made illegal fast. And the door shut on it very rapidly.
On October 6, 1966, LSD becomes illegal in California. 2 years later, the federal government introduces a law making possession a misdemeanor and sale a felony. But the government can't stop the psychedelic movement. Its very illegality makes it more alluring. Sales of black market acid soar. Rock music spreads the LSD message around the world. Songs by The Doors, The Rolling Stones, The Grateful Dead, among others, allude to the acid experience. In 1967, the Beatles produced their psychedelic masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, with its surreal imagery of tangerine trees and marmalade skies. That same year, the psychedelic movement begins to drown in its own popularity. Haight-Ashbury is now a popular tourist attraction. It's the summer of love.
All the floodgates were open. There was newspaper reporters from all over the world, drunks, roustabouts, vagabonds, drug addicts, Hell's Angels. Everybody came to the Haight. It was an open party. A lot of hard drugs came into the Haight. The mafia came into the Haight. So everything started to go downhill.
America descends into a period of increasing social unrest. Political assassinations, the escalation of the war in Vietnam, racial unrest, and student activism turn the country into a battlefield. Society is polarized.
The use of LSD became identified with protests against the Vietnam War and efforts to radical social movements in society. And as a result, the dangers of one became conflated with the dangers or the perceived dangers of another. If you were against the war and that was seen as unpatriotic, taking LSD became unpatriotic to the minds of the members of the establishment.
With Richard Nixon's election to the presidency in 1968 came his declaration of a war on drugs. But little does this president know how close he comes to taking an acid trip himself. A tea party is planned for the alumni of Tricia Nixon's alma mater, Finch College, and one of the graduates invited is rock star Grace Slick.
And I called up Abby Hoffman, asked him if he wanted to go to a tea at the White House. And we decided probably Nixon needed about 600 micrograms of acid, which is a pretty heavy dose. And it's very small, so you can carry it in your pocket. So I could have reached into my pocket and gone right over his teacup, and he wouldn't have even noticed. It's tasteless.
But the scheme fails when White House security recognizes her.
We never got in. Not because I wasn't invited, but because they recognized Grace Slick, unfortunately, and said, "I'm sorry, you can't come in." And I said, "Well, but I have an invitation." And they said, "Well, you can't come in because I'm on the FBI list." I guess because of some of my lyrics, I don't know.
By the end of the 60s, the acid culture is losing steam. Press reports of LSD suicides are increasingly in the news, and acid is linked to the Manson family's horrific Tate LaBianca murders.
LSD began to be demonized in almost all of the media. You did not read a positive story about this. Most people don't know that it even had this extraordinary scientific career.
when we continue, the government cracks down on LSD and Timothy Leary.
The judge declared him the most dangerous man in the world.
In the 1960s, LSD tablets might be decorated with the Batman logo or Superman's insignia. In the 1990s, the most popular design chosen by manufacturers of illicit LSD is Bart Simpson's head. History's Mysteries will be right back here on the History Channel.
By the late 60s, LSD becomes public drug enemy #1. Anyone associated with the drug culture is targeted. In 1970, Timothy Leary is arrested for possession of marijuana and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Also in 1970, a newly created federal agency, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, puts LSD in its Schedule 1 category, a classification reserved for addictive drugs of no redeeming value. Although illegal, LSD has a very active underground life. There is still a great demand for it, and it's not hard to get. It is a staple at youth parties known as raves. The irony is that LSD can be obtained illegally without much difficulty, but legitimate researchers have virtually no access to the drug.
What really ended at the end of the 60s was the scientific use of LSD. And a lot of researchers feel a little bit like Galileo, that they had the first telescope that could look at what consciousness was, how the psyche was formed, how bodily energies get transformed into what we call consciousness. And they lost that telescope, not for any scientific reasons, but wholly for cultural reasons. And they would like to see it restored.
If the government does sanction LSD research again, where will it lead?
There was so much potential. We should go back and look at what other kinds of medical applications there have, what other kinds of applications for therapy, what other kinds of insights might be shed on how the mind works.
Yet the unpredictability of the drug is still a major problem.
It is a very strong drug. On the one hand, you hear me explaining it as being this exquisite revelation. And on the other hand, I'm saying, look out because you might jump out a window. That's the problem, is you never know.
Absolutely, there are people in mental institutions that you can say that the spring that put them there, the little vehicle they rode into that appalling state was LSD.
As for the CIA, the agency has expressed regret for its drug experiments with human subjects. But intelligence officials have yet to make public details relating to the mysterious death of Army biological research scientist Dr. Frank Olson.
After the Watergate scandal, there was kind of a house cleaning that went on within the CIA. And some of the scandals came to light involving the CIA and LSD and other drugs. There were public hearings in the Congress, and some of this information came out. So there were these perfunctory apologies given, and there were certainly apologies given to the Olson family who survived Frank Olson's death. But generally speaking, that's as far as it went.
Today, LSD's inventor, Albert Hofmann, after a long and distinguished career as a research chemist, is retired and living in Switzerland. Ken Kesey is still writing, lecturing, and touring, and still exploring the mysteries of LSD.
I'll take acid every time. It's a shortcut to enlightenment that we were given at the end of this century for those of us who would like to go on to better realities and understand it with respect and say, okay, the door has been opened. This is the key that opened it.
After nearly 50 years of study, Dr. Oscar Janiger is also still involved with the drug.
I don't think it was a fad. I think that it did change the fabric of society. I sincerely do. Maybe not in the dramatic way that they might have anticipated, but certainly in subtle ways. We're never going to be the same as we were before 1960.
Aldous Huxley died on November 22, 1963. He soared into the afterlife after receiving his last request, an injection of LSD. Timothy Leary's imprisonment in 1970 did nothing to diminish his enthusiastic advocacy for LSD.
Leary was busted for pot. The judge declared him the most dangerous man in the world. And he was sentenced to, I believe, 10 years in prison. The Weather Underground shortly thereafter broke him out.
and went on a kind of wild tour de force through Africa, Europe, Asia. Ended up being nabbed again by federal narcotics agents in Afghanistan, of all places. In 1973, he was brought back to the United States and given even a longer prison term. He was facing a really long time in prison. He eventually was let out in 1976 because apparently he cooperated to some degree with federal authorities. He toned down his drug advocacy in the late 70s after he got out of jail. But he became one of the early pioneers for computers and software. He became an advocate of space travel and space migration. And to the day he died, he was a controversial person, saying controversial things.
The most identifiable icon of the psychedelic culture, Timothy Leary, dies on May 30th, 1996.
Do you have the freedom to do with your nervous system what you want, which was always Tim Leary's great cri de coeur. And in a culture that accepts the manipulation of our consciousness, of our psyche, from so many different agents, from Prozac to Valium to caffeine to chocolate to whatever, is there a place for LSD? Yeah, I think there should be.
The cultural upheaval that accompanied widespread use of LSD in the 60s halted most serious research in the drug, and popular use declined. But according to a recent federal survey, there now appears to be a sudden upsurge of interest in psychedelic drugs, particularly among high school students. All the more reasons, some scientists say, for resuming research into the properties of the most potent hallucinogen in the world. Now, let's see what's coming up on the next History's Mysteries. I'm Arthur Kent for the History Channel. Thanks for watching.
Discover more about this and every History's Mysteries topic at historychannel.com.
Delve into the past to uncover history's most intriguing mysteries.
The Holy Grail. Worst maritime disasters. Condemned as a witch, then
Count Dracula. 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Join Arthur Kent as we travel around the world to unlock history's best-kept secrets.
This is where history really took place. This is where history really is.
History's Mysteries with Arthur Kent. Weeknights at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific on the History Channel.
Declassified and disclosed. The History Channel is proud to present on home video the episode you've just seen of History's Mysteries for only $19.95 plus shipping and handling. Call 1-800-708-1776 or order online at historychannel.com.